The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. The following video is presented by the Center for Educational Media in partnership with Professional Educators of Tennessee's Leader U Conference. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
I have actually worked with children, even though I am trained as, I have a lot of different ways that I've been trained. I like to say that I'm a developmental cognitive scientist. I also am trained in neuroimaging, and I've done researching in both our U.S. veteran populations to look at neurotoxic exposure during the first Gulf War and their central nervous system. And I've published pretty extensively in that domain. So I look at development across the lifespan time. In children, I've looked and studied in two particular things: literacy acquisition and development, and atypical forms of that, dyslexia being one of those forms, the one that I primarily have studied, and also memory acquisition and eyewitness memory, and how we can improve interviewing techniques so that we can have children be able to testify on their own behalf when something nasty and heinous happens to them, without perjuring themselves on the stand and discrediting themselves as eyewitnesses. So those have been the three more applied aspects of what I do. But at the basic level, I study how we develop a brain that allows us to think and reason and interact with the world and achieve goals. So I recently came to MTSU to take over the Chair of Excellence, which has been vacated by Dr. Diane Sawyer, who set this up many years ago, and I oversee the Tennessee Center for the Study and Treatment of Dyslexia. So what I do when I present is a little bit different than what my assistant directors do in one of our full-day trainings, or even 2 or 3 day trainings that we do across the state now. We've seen 2,000 teachers this year in in-service services all over the state. That's 4 times what we did the previous year. We've tested just as many children this year as we always have. And we now have a structured literacy program that allows for professionals, educators, to come in, which will be starting in the end of July. They'll come in for 2 full weeks. They'll come in for seminar days, and we'll be doing on-site practicums and observing their instruction of what we're teaching them with actual dyslexics in the field across the state. That will lead to certification for them as educators through either the Academic Language Therapists Association or the International Dyslexia Association, which is a new facet, which is really the kind of one of the culminations of Diane's vision. So that's kind of what we do and what we're doing. So when my assistant directors go out, there's a lot more hands-on work. There's a lot more working with different things. What I do is I give you an overview. I'm going to give you a couple different case studies. I'm going to show you the different materials that we've developed that we teach teachers to use for our identification model that we have, which is well aligned with the Tennessee's Department of Education. And then our training models and what we teach, which again is really well aligned to Read to Be Ready. So when people ask what is dyslexia, it's more than just the definition. But in the state of Tennessee, we've adopted, as of our 2014 legislation, the definition that is a research-based definition that was adopted by the International Dyslexia Association in 2002. This was the culmination of many years of work. The first definition that was a consensus definition was actually drafted at Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for Children, which is where I did it wasn't a residency, but where I did my teacher training during my postdoc that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. Then they started working in the 90s and into the 2000s for the International Dyslexia Association to use that and some other ones to update that, to give us this. We'll be taking this definition and breaking apart into its constituents, its parts, and linking that back to literacy development and where the chunks go and why we see certain characteristics. At a very basic level, a child who has dyslexia has a problem reading. Now, reading is actually multi-component, right? There's many different aspects. The ultimate goal, and if you're reading, you comprehend. We actually have to be able to read the text accurately on that page and fluently to be able to extract that meaning from the text, and that helps us. So it can go clunk. Individuals with dyslexia tend to fall in the lower portion of this continuum, and if they're unremediated and haven't had any assistance or help, they definitely fall on the lower end of this continuum. Now, what you have to acknowledge is the complexity of what teachers and you guys do. You don't just get this perfect little case study that is the perfect example of anything. You live in a world where there are various factors that are impacting what your children can and can't do, what you need them to do. In this sense, reading achievement. And in the state of Tennessee, like all the other states, we tend to measure this based as almost one measure on a high stakes measure of can they comprehend a text at their grade level? And where does their proficiency fall? That's how we do it. That's kind of a legacy of No Child Left Behind, and it's definitely still what's in place in schools. So what could impact a child's ability to, one, pass that one single metric, but more importantly, be an actual proficient reader in a larger sense? Really be able to read and comprehend. Well, we have biopsychosocial factors. We have their motivation. We have their sense of self-efficacy. Is this something they feel they can do? And we have their student engagement. Is this something that they feel attracted and drawn to want to do? Those will all impact a child's achievement, and they should all be considered, correct? Right. We can all agree to that. There's also environmental factors. So we know that a child who finds themselves in an enriched home environment where mom and dad speak with an elevated level of language and use complex syntax and grammatical structure to put things together, even from an early age, will have wonderful vocabulary acquisition most of the time. Will learn how to speak and have exchanges and speak with pragmatics. We also know that when we have a really well-trained, educated teacher in all of the disciplines talking with that elevated language and academic language in the classroom, that supports those knowledge-based skills of literacy as well. We also know that there's more skills-based stuff that we have to have. I'm sad to say, like to point out that one of our nation's largest school districts has 77% of the students come in below proficiency on their pre-literacy skills each year. They walk in the doors from their home environment not prepared for school, which sets up the teachers in that school with a big challenge. They don't have the vocabulary they need to be successful. They don't have the oral language skills they need to be successful. They've not learned any of their letters, their rhyming skills. They're all deficient. And there's only so much that we can do as educators in our limited amount of time, so it really takes both factors of those. But that would obviously impact reading achievement. There's also neurobiological factors. We now know that our genotype and how our genes work influences how our brain functions and develops. So we had started, when it comes to dyslexia in particular, looking at behavioral genetics over many decades to try to understand why we see some individuals, both with oral language skills and specific language impairments that are more expressive and receptive in nature for oral communication, as well as written. Seems to be two forms of this that seem to have a brain basis to it. There's something different, and it goes back to their genes. It started with behavioral studies in twins. A lot of this work was done in Colorado, looking to see if there was some family inheritance of being a really bad struggling reader who struggles to read words accurately. It turns out there's a high instance of that. So we've moved past that. We still do those things, but we've moved to molecular genetics now. So we're actually looking at specific expressions of the genotype and variations of very specific aspects. I'm not going to bore you with my brain imaging research, but I will bring up one example of slides to point out some aspects of what we think about dyslexia. And one of those candidate genes is what allows for the white matter tracking that connects the left and right hemispheres in the frontal lobes to connect, which has been found by my research to be a marker of treatment resistance as well as response in kids with dyslexia who are receiving the best of the best instruction from the best educators in a clinical setting. So we're moving well past what we used to do with all of this. We're also now not just limited to single case studies of looking at somebody who has not developed what they should have in being able to read, and then just looking at what that is and then waiting for them to die and then cutting up their brains. We can actually now non-invasively go in and study their brains through different methodologies, which is a great advancement. We also have cognitive factors. So I'd like to point out that we've already covered all of those other factors, There are variability in cognitive skills that allow us to actually acquire language and literacy at both the expressive and receptive levels as well as the written levels and being able to read what we do. I've got some of these up here. So vocabulary, for example, is a very good predictor of word level reading as well as comprehension. It's one of the strongest predictors of reading comprehension that we have. It wins out in most modeling above working memory, for example, in the developmental research. At the word level for accuracy, phonological awareness, which is our ability to hear the sound structure within words, is one of the best predictors. And at the rate and efficiency level, our ability to actually call off what we see in the objects in the world is one of the best predictors. So again, reading is comprehension. So one of the simplest views of this is actually called the simple view of reading, which was developed in the 1970s and then extended. It's a real simple thing. How do we actually get meaning from print in our world? Well, we have to have this really strong basis in oral comprehension and language skills, a really solid expressive and receptive vocabulary. For example, we also be able to actually have to read those words and know what they are. So vocabulary would go up there, our understanding of the meaning units within words, morphology, the fact that we have these affixes that we can put on the base word and change its meaning, those are important for us to know. Amazingly, I always like to cite Burko's study from the 60s. I think it was the 60s when she did this as her dissertation. But she was a professor at Northwestern studying linguistics back then. And what she was able to do was to show that, kids pick up this ability to know that our language is generative, that we can add S to something. So she has her famous WUG task, and so she shows this thing that looks like the little partridge from the partridge family's opening going across. And she says, "Hey kid, look what I got." I'm like, "Oh really? What's that?" "It's a WUG." And it's like, "Oh yeah, you got a WUG." And it's like, "Hey look, I got another one. Now what have they got?" And so these 3- and 4-year-olds are going, "You got WUGs, dum-dum." So they're able to generate a new word by knowing that I affix that at the end of WUG to make it more than one. Syntactic structure. So being able to actually put strings of words together in a structure that allows us to actually express meaning. Now, executive function kind of rolls all around all of this. This is our ability to engage in behaviors that succeed in a goal. So that would be things like our ability to sustain, switch, and be vigilant with our attention. Inhibition, to inhibit a prepotent response. Working memory, monitoring what we're doing for like reading comprehension, that ability to actually have self-awareness and monitor what we're doing, monitor the meaning we're extracting, find those discrepancies, go back and correct those, as well as task switching when we have to switch from one aspect to another. Now at the word level and actually pulling the print off the page, obviously reading fluency is massive. Word reading accuracy is also important. You can also be efficient at word level reading. Phonological decoding makes up a portion of what we do with words. And then letter knowledge and phonological awareness undergird that, but also sight words. Those irregular words, our ability to actually read those and see those by sight. There's a couple different theories about how reading develops. I don't want to bore you any more than I already am, so we'll just kind of skip past any of those aspects. But that all undergirds that. We want to be accurate. We also want to be automatic with these skills. So the rapid automatized naming, as I've already mentioned, helps to support that automaticity. So what I've been trying to do since I've been in Tennessee is kind of get a feel for the state and where you guys are and kind of what would help you guys in the schools. So I want to boil that definition down to its central characteristic in school-age kids that you would be seeing. A child who struggles with dyslexia is going to have issues with accurately reading words, decoding words, and doing that quickly with automaticity. They'll also have issues with spelling. We're actually going to do a symposium for October for Dyslexia Awareness Month called Spelling, the Other Characteristic of Dyslexia. And with written expression, we often see these. So that's kind of the holy triumvirate when it comes to dyslexia. Now, every child's not dyslexic, guys. Look, I said there was environmental factors. There could be lack of instruction in the classroom. There could have been lack of support. So you're seeing early risk factors in kindergarten, but it's not really neurobiologically based. You cannot have an environment create a dyslexic, for example. That doesn't happen. So if we're going to make this distinction between something that's neurobiologically based, we also have to know that there's these garden variety struggling readers, and some of them will have problems and look like this. But here's the kicker, which has been here since the very beginning. back when Hinchelwood and Samuel Orton were looking at case studies in their clinics back in the early 1900s. It's always been said that dyslexia is a lack of response to good instruction. That's always been said. There's never been a time when everybody's ever said that dyslexia was something other than what I'm showing you here, probably something based on the brain. We now know that pretty definitively. And you always have to have that caveat of they've been given the chance to actually succeed with instruction. So what causes dyslexia? This is obviously the million-dollar question. Just like cancer, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, we'd love to know what causes these things. They're real conditions. They really impact people. There's a neurobiological and genetic basis. But if we knew what caused Parkinson's, I'd be able to go fix those dopamine neurons and they'd stay there. But we don't know that. So we can put stuff in a person's brain with Parkinson's, fix that area of the brain, but the disease will still come back and kill it. It'd be great to know what causes cancer. We'd be able to fix it. But just because we don't know what causes something, we're still thinking at a theoretical level and a practical level what causes it till we can inform how we actually treat it. Doesn't mean it's not real. I'm talking about the developmental form of dyslexia, not from getting bumped on the head, having a stroke, having a tumor, having something of that nature. These are the first two theories proposed for developmental dyslexia. The first one is visual memory, proposed by Hinchelwood in his work, who's a Scottish ophthalmologist. It wasn't that they didn't see the words right, it was that they couldn't have visual memory for the words. So he was focusing on that. That's wrong. It's not been proven to be accurate. Dyslexia is not about vision. It's a language-based learning difference. Another one was from Samuel Orton, who inspired a wonderful neuroscientist, Norman Geschwin. And he had this theory of hemispheric dominance. As you know, language is left lateralized. You also know that the left hemisphere in the language areas is a little bit larger in most people than in the right. His hypothesis was that these individuals who struggle to develop the ability to read must have some hemispheric mismatch in how it works. That's also wrong. It's not the case. So we kind of get our second round of causal explanations for dyslexia. Sensory integration, putting those letters and sounds together to allow you to decode, read words. There's some support for that. There's some support for some very key brain networks that would allow us to do that. Speech sound processing, so hearing the auditory stream of speech at some level and being able to do that. One of my colleagues here, Cyril Monnier, works at the very fine grain level and uses EEG to get in that and is actually looking at where stress patterns fall in words to see if there's some disconnect in the temporal processing of that information that would cause what we often see, which is a phonological processing deficit. The magnocellular vision attention network. We often see in the thalamus in this region differences on structural scans. This does not seem to be a causal factor, but more of a byproduct factor. Same thing with, I don't have that up there. Representations and auditory memory. So it could be, kind of like the old idea of visual memory, that they don't have a good memorial representation instead of representations for speech sounds. Perceptual signal processing in general, just being able to find the signal through all that noise out there. Memory consolidation has some support for it, but not much. There was recently a study done by one of my colleagues, Ken Pugh, looking at this. I've got the parvocellular vision system up there now. Again, seems to be a byproduct, not causal. Ken Pugh and Fumiko Hafe, two of my colleagues, have been looking at this noisy neurosignal aspect. There's actually differences in how neurotransmitters function in the brains of individuals with dyslexia, and which could be giving rise to some of the speech processing and signal processing deficits that we almost always see in these individuals. Another one up there that just was published out of a large study that was done across the entire spectrum of development as well as in adulthood is neural adaptation, which is linked very systematically back to this noisy neural signal. This comes out of a group that was looking at over time when we have sensory information coming in our neurons and a population is firing, that sustained firing will eventually dampen down. It's a way that we can help in the early stages and get some attention for free. We're now actually doing a study at the center, and we have some evidence that this seems to be impacting their ability to be in noisy situations and to be able to process that simulation and do just as well on attention tasks as their peers. This would be an important theory, right? Because if you're in a noisy classroom, we know that they need direct instruction. Why might it be so important to be explicit with them? It could be because they're not able to pick up the signaling they need to actually learn what they need to do to be successful, which could give rise to having a proper auditory memorial representation as well as speech processing. All right. The two key kind of helpful theories that we currently go with, and the one that motivates the IDA and the Tennessee definition. The first one is the phonological core variability deference model, which was introduced by a gentleman named Keith Stanovich. This is the idea that there is a phonological awareness processing deficit in individuals with dyslexia, which then impedes their ability to learn these sound simple correspondences and decode words and learn word identification. It's definitely the theory that motivated much of the center's work up until now, and will continue to motivate our work because it's still the best explanation of the majority of individuals that we would call developmental dyslexic. Yet, probably the more accurate approach is to say and to adopt a multiple deficit hypothesis. And I heard some chitter chatter before I got in here about somebody who might have an attention deficit problem. They might also have a RAN problem in addition to a core phonological processing deficit. So Bruce Pennington, who does work in the identification of learning disabilities more generally, has proposed this idea that there could be this multiple deficit hypothesis. And so why would some children persist and not respond? It's because maybe they have a core deficit that would prevent learning, as well as some other deficits that are just exacerbating that completely and making it very difficult for them to respond. My first study in dyslexia, which I started a long time ago, but eventually I did get published in 2008 in brain imaging, and I was trying to answer a very simple question. Does brain imaging differentiate treatment responders and non-responders? In doing that, I actually informed, because I was thinking that I would, that debate or that question about a core phonological processing deficit only, or maybe also something else that comes along for the ride. So what I was able to do was look in do patient record pools out of a clinical setting in Dallas and find kids that had gotten 2 years of very good instruction for dyslexia from the people who wrote the program. It's comprehensive. It covered all the 5 areas of reading. They got morphology training. They got comprehension. They got oral language development. They got vocabulary development in addition to word identification, spelling, and reading skills. And they got their phonological awareness training. They would go in for an hour and a half every day for 4 days a week for 2 full years. Very intensive. Covered everything. It was basically a literacy block built for a child with dyslexia, is the way I would kind of describe it. What I was interested in is looking at was finding kids who went through that much treatment but still couldn't decode words, which is not reading. But if you spent that much time working on that sub-skill, if you can't decode words after that and you're not in the average range, you're a very special, unique little butterfly. And so I wanted to study those. Then I looked at an age and gender matched control group of kids that went through the center's training, and they were able to read, and they were able to do phonological decoding. And then I looked at some age and gender controls that were neurotypicals, typical developing. What I noticed was every kid that went through in those 3 groups had average PA. And the 2 kids in the dyslexic group started well below average on their phonological awareness. But they remediated the phonological awareness. What they didn't do was they didn't remediate their decoding skills, that integration of the sound structure back to the letters, even though they spent a lot of time working on it. Which doesn't mean that the phonological processing deficit hypothesis isn't right. It means that one of these more basic theories about what this is probably causing for phonological awareness. So this is a characteristic signal of something probably deeper that's going on. Otherwise, how can I remediate PA, embed that within all this wonderful rich instruction, and have these kids still not be able to do decoding? Can't sound out and read and pronounce nonsense words. I used a very simple task to look at these kids. They would hear a letter sound, and they would see 2 letters on the screen simultaneously, and they would just tell me which one went with the sound. So they would hear P, and they would tell me if it was a P or a B. These are actually voiced and unvoiced pairs. Probably know there's a good teacher right there. She's like, yep, yes, they are. And then I had a simple subtraction control task where they would hear a tone, they would see 2 symbols, they'd make a button press. I was trying to subtract out the non-language based processing. That was the idea. So I've got my three groups here. I've got in my blue graph here, I've actually never shown it in my research in a kind of a public setting like this, so this may be a good thing, this may be a bad thing. Anyway, the blue bar here are my treatment responders. I've got my controls, my neurotypicals, age and gender matched, and also my non-responders. And you'll notice in this key area for language processing that we've known about since the late 1800s, we call it Broca's area. It's a very important area for many cognitive functions and functions in general. We call it a hub area now because it connects a network of regions and is a gateway to tie things together. That my treatment resistors are not activating this area as much as my typical developing kids and my treatment responders. They're not pulling out this language area, which is involved in phonological awareness, but not the memorial representation of phonological awareness. This is the manipulation. And when it comes to this task, this is a planning area right before they go to the motor cortex so they can actually produce those sounds or words. Now, the secondary auditory cortex that would actually be processing the auditory signal coming in, the language signal in the left hemisphere, is right here. And you'll actually notice that they're equivalent and actually just graphically the largest responses out of my treatment non-responders. So auditory processing is not differentiating my three groups anymore. What is an area known as the angular gyrus as well as the inferior parietal lobe. This actually was what Henschel would, as well as the very first people that were looking at what was called word blindness, acquired word blindness, so through some kind of a trauma, not a developmental form of it, we're looking at. So this area does lots of things as well. It's also a hub area. So we're seeing that my treatment resistors and also my dyslexics, it's these hubs that are showing the differences, these areas that integrate processing. One of the things that's unfortunate about the case study approach was it got us to thinking about localization of function, that there was like a region that did this, there was a region that did that, opposed to what they probably all knew eventually. Norman Geschwin would have known this, but doesn't have the tools to do it. Our brain works like a symphony and is controlled, and it all has to sing and go at the same time and allow us to do it. And then, what we're still studying today, and actually we're about to submit a new manuscript for publication out of an adult sample that we did imaging on, is this area right here in the right hemisphere. It's the right hemisphere homologue from that left area that you were looking at. So you'll notice that my treatment responders have the most activation out of this area. Our current hypothesis about this is that this is an intentional inhibition network and selection. It works in combination with another area called the anterior cingulate cortex, and it allows us to go in and actually see inconsistent orthographic structure. English is a very deep language, right? You know, pint says pint, not pent. So we have to be able to actually learn these consistencies and regularities across our language, and being able to pull in attention networks to inhibit a response to just want to go with the primary thing that we think that should do is probably pretty important from a learning standpoint as well as a developmental standpoint. The important reason for showing you that is that those kids had their PA remediated and there's something else, which just highlights we don't really know what's causing dyslexia, even though I can show you key differences in brain function across these three different areas, and that's just one of my many studies in brain imaging. So let's get back to more actual practical things for you. What you need to know is kind of what you're looking for, right? So we don't diagnose or identify dyslexia super early, but what we're looking for are early risk factors so we can identify kids at high risk and start getting them into proper prevention services. So in preschool and kindergarten, what we're looking for is a delay in talking and articulatory problems. Those are all language-based issues. We're looking for difficulty with recognizing and producing rhymes, difficulty with matching words by initial sounds. Those are phonological processing skills, phonological awareness skills. Difficulty remembering directions. That would be a phonological memory, which is also a phonological processing skill. So short-term memory. And a family history is the strongest predictor because we do have very strong behavioral genetics evidence out of the twin studies out of Colorado that it's family linked, genetically based. Now, the twin studies are important because, of course, if you have the same environment as your parents, and that's just kind of, the environment's kind of linked. So in twin studies, they actually find mono and dizygotic twins. They also find these special little twin samples that live in different houses. So they do it very elegantly to try to control for the environmental factors. Because just because your mom and dad had dyslexia, you could say, oh, well, of course they're going to have dyslexia because those parents don't like to read, or those parents don't want to help because they're the dyslexics themselves. And sure, that might be true, but in the studies that make us aware of these risk factors and the genetics behind it, that was controlled for. Grade 1 through 3. Confusion of letters whose letters whose sounds are similar. So I was just showing you some of those, the voiced and unvoiced pairs, for example. There's another one, d and t. Problems segmenting words and individual sounds and blending sounds to form words. Both of those are phonological awareness skills, hearing and discriminating speech sounds. Difficulty learning sound symbol correspondences. So linking their letters and their sounds together. I was doing research that I'm about to get on a conference call with a hospital in Dallas with right before I came over here. What we're also pushing forward with is to help us get past this notion that I think the commissioner would like us to get past too, is we really need to be attacking more complex phonics and word structure, and that we can teach most kids, if not all of them, simple apple, a, beep, bap, buh. We can do that. What differentiates my treatment response with the research that I'm doing now are polysyllabic words, because those buggers are difficult in our language, right? An unaccented syllable. I mean, it's not like A says two things, guys. Those reading teachers, I mean, you got one right there. A says I have everything, and it always goes, So schwa happens. So where we find the difficulty is with the more complex structure. And what one limitation that you guys have, and a lot of you who are in the fields know this is if you're using AIM-WEBs or DIBBLs and you're using a non-word fluency, which is not the target for instruction, Real Words is, but it's a diagnostic tool. They only do closed syllable taps with words with 2 or 3 phonemes and graphemes. That's not going to tap anything. So of course we have kids come in into the center who, when we look a little bit deeper, we find that they are a false negative on the screeners. When we dig a little bit deeper, we find real evidence for accuracy in real word reading as well as nonsense word reading. We often find that they can't read their R controls, their diphthongs, their vowel teams, which many of those are highly inconsistent. Just think about EA, for example. It says a lot of different things, guys. And then even the ones who have done a little bit better with Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction will now fall apart with polysyllabic words. And that's going to be the hardest thing to get our little kids with dyslexia to do. And of course, the treatment response rates will help to delineate those who might have a more persistent neurobiological basis and those who are garden variety. Reading and spelling errors involve errors that involve difficulties with sequencing and monitoring additions, slip and sip, substitutions, rip and rib, and transpositions, stop and pots. Again, kind of this indication there's something out with the auditory language system, again, language-based. Because in the 1970s, Frank Valentino kind of ripped us to actually respond to the research that had been done away from thinking that dyslexia, the myth of it being about seeing and seeing letters and words backwards, to the reality it's a language-based learning difference, based in language centers and the distribution of those hubs that connect regions that support language across all languages. Chinese, which is okay. Grade 3, confusions of letters whose sounds are similar. Again, we've got the same things here. Difficulty learning sound symbol correspondences, reading and spelling errors that involve difficulties with sequencing and monitoring additions. We got that. And difficulty remembering spelling words over time and applying spelling rules when writing. So, most of you probably wouldn't think that I would say this. A lot of our kids are just going to pick reading up. You guys know this as teachers. They're in spite of us kids, the majority of them. All of them will do a little bit better and learn a little bit more quickly when we use really direct systematic instruction. What we see, though, is that if you don't do the direct systematic instruction, you just don't get the learning. So whereas one child who is developmentally normal, good home environment, has all the things going for them, will be able to look at the structure of language and through a few exposures, a little bit of direct instruction, pick that up. And spelling kind of comes along for the ride. But the other characteristic of dyslexia is spelling. So when that language network in the brain isn't developing appropriately, we see those reading accuracy difficulties mirrored in our spelling difficulties. Now, from a research standpoint, Patricia Mathis, others have done the research to demonstrate that spelling instruction is helpful, and it should be a skill that's taught in K through 3 directly. And linking that back to your core reading program and the word structure you're teaching is beneficial, and that's been demonstrated. Grades 4 through 8. Significant difficulty reading and spelling multisyllabic words. I've hinted on that one. That is a real issue. Frequent misreadings of common sight words. Lack of awareness of word structure. You know, they said word blindness because they were selectively blind to those words. They could see everything else around them. That's why they originally started calling these case studies they found of these people who either required a selective reading problem without any oral language problems, or these kids that developed these problems. Really, it's a language blindness if you want to really think about it. Language in the written language doesn't hold much information for these kids or much meaning, so they don't pick much out of it. And morphological structure is highly linked back to the letter patterning, the orthography of our language. So you won't get very advanced morphological structure if you ignore word structure. Difficulty with reading comprehension and learning new information from text because of an underlying word recognition difficulty. Significant difficulty in writing related to problems in spelling and organization. It still persists in the high school. We see this, if they're compensated, as still being slow and inefficient. Now, it'll still have problems with the accurate word reading that's going to impact their ability to pick up knowledge. A compensated dyslexic who's passing your state reading assessments, who, when I look a little bit deeper at the center, fails on an accuracy word reading measure, and when I look at their oral reading measures off of a screener and or like the Wechsler measures or the Woodcock measures, I see a great passage because they're just speeding through it, but I see an accuracy that's in the dismal range and they're well below average on that. So I'm building you a picture of what you could be looking for, right guys? You could see these patterns. We're going to have a case study here in a second. Continued difficulty with spelling and written composition, and trouble learning a foreign language. This could go back to the fact that this is language-based difficulty. Susan Gathercole did the seminal research from a cognitive development standpoint about the importance of phonological memory and phonological processing for the acquisition of one vocabulary as well as a second language. So if a child were having a multiple deficit in phonological memory in particular, they would have a problem because they have this deficit that would prevent them from being able to pick up the secondary language vocabulary as quickly and easily as their peers. So if we go back to our reading wall here and we look at kind of the structure, what you'll see when you're looking, especially if you're not looking at spelling. Now, if you're looking at written output, you will see the spelling. And most of you in any grade can do that. And in fact, as a screener for secondary, it's a really quick, easy, dirty way to do it. You know, in high school and middle school, we often get away from accuracy-based reading measures, and we're dealing with comprehension measures. But you can always administer a group spelling test, bring it back up, and just ask if they're being able to spell, and use that as a screener to find kids who might have underlying word reading deficits that you're not picking up because they're compensating and able to pass your comprehension tests that are not text dependent. One of the things that we now know, thanks to a lot of research out of Vanderbilt and other places, is that reading comprehension as a construct is not the easiest thing to measure. And some measures are text independent where you can answer questions if you're a bright little compensated little boy or girl without even reading the text. Which is a real issue when you're trying to find children who have word reading deficits when your screeners aren't really linked back to actually needing to read the text. So let's look at the definition. A condition that is characterized by difficulty with accurate and or fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities. So I've indicated that those are kind of our core characteristics. You often will see a reading fluency. Now I've highlighted one profile. I don't think I'll ever actually publish this finding, so I'll just simply say what it is that we've been using the center data to look at from a probabilistic, because part of what the center does is that we do data analysis on lots of data over thousands of kids to look and see patterns. One of the things that we find is that we can find kids that will be false negatives on something like a timed measure of reading efficiency and or fluency, because their rate is very quick. They are very persistent little gritty little kids that will grit their teeth and bear and go through it. And so their accuracy score is dismal, but they got so much way through it, they tried so many that it just looks like they're okay. And they'll come up as positive. Like, hey man, this kid's great, they're fine, push them on through. But it's because they've rat-a-lat-tat off very quickly. So what you can always do with a measure of efficiency or oral reading fluency is you can look at both the rate measure as well as the accuracy measure, and you can also look at the combination of those two, the oral, kind of an oral reading fluency quotient. And we would recommend that you do that because it would be just another source of data to look at. Decoding, I slipped now, we also have the spelling, which is encoding, the flip of decoding. This isn't one of our, it's probably in this, I would hope it's in our standards now. I'll have to go back and review all of those updated ones, but it's often neglected, so both instructionally as well as looking at it. It's a really great screener for your secondary students though, and it's quick and easy to do. Typically result from a deficit in one or more processes related to the phonological component of language. So this goes back to that phonological core deficit hypothesis, which is one of the motivations and the science behind the IDA and the Tennessee definition. So when it comes to the accuracy components, the phonological piece that we look at is phonological awareness, the ability to hear within words and hear their onset rhyme, their rhyme on their word body form, be able to break it down into syllables, their ability to actually hear the individual sounds that go with each of the letters or letter formations that go to a single sound like CH, TH. Rapid automatized naming is often considered another phonological processing skill, and it's linked back to that rapidity, the quickness, the speed with which they can do these skills. Often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. This is a hallmark of the history of dyslexia. We started looking at this not in children, because if you think about the late 1800s, not all kids were taught how to read. Not all kids needed to read to go out into the fields to work, to do what they would do. It wouldn't be unexpected if a child grew up and couldn't read. What was unexpected was when you had a professor of French wake up one morning and no longer be able to read French or English, but be able to talk to you, hold a conversation, and have a selective reading disability that he acquired due to a stroke probably. Then you go in, you open up his brain, and you see that there's key areas in those areas that I was showing you that now have been damaged because he did have a stroke, he lost oxygen, and he has brain damage in key areas. That's remarkable and unexpected that somebody would wake up one day and have a very selective issue with reading and understanding. Looking at something and not being what they were to see. But as we started coming along and we started noticing that there were these kids who had all this opportunity in different countries, they should be learning how to read, but they weren't. So it was this unexpected aspect of it. It's unexpected because they've had all the opportunities they need to be able to do it. How that got operationalized for the longest time was an intelligence quotient, ability discrepancy, which we no longer use for lots of reasons, and I'm sure you're an educated audience that knows those reasons. And you'll also notice the provision of effective classroom instruction, which again, when we started looking at the developmental forms of case studies, that was a prerequisite because that was part of what made it unexpected. In the early 1900s, when we didn't have everybody going to school and learning how to read, it would not be unexpected if a child didn't learn how to read because they didn't get any instruction to go to school. Illiteracy was still a real issue in a different way in this country and around the world at that time, and still is in other parts of the world. May result in problems in reading comprehension and reduced experience that may impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. These are the secondary consequences in a pure individual that has a neurobiological basis for word reading difficulties, dyslexia. There's a separate neurologically based issue that also was being studied in the late 1800s into the 1900s and started being studied in the developmental form that was really picked up by speech paths. That would be the oral and expressive language skills deficits that we see. And you can acquire selective deficits in those as well through strokes, tumors, and some type of problem. So the secondary consequences of a pure dyslexic would be reading comprehension and vocabulary. We don't see many of those, right? Because of all those factors I showed you. I mean, you could have a home environment, you could have lack of instruction in the classroom, it gets it hard to delineate, which is why we use RTI to help delineate and weed through those. We can quickly pace through and look at response over several months, and we can start to make some clarifying decisions. So what does it look like when word reading deficits prevent a child from comprehending written language? I want to show you one way of thinking about this, which is kind of the old way, where we go and we have this structured formal assessment that's done. And then the second case study we're going to cover is going to cover kind of the RTI square kind of way. Like, what do you see when you see it happening and you want to prevent it from getting worse? So, you know, the old way of doing this, and still the way that would happen if mom and dad or a teacher thought that we should do a formal assessment and get the diagnostician or school psychologist involved, would be to have something like this, where we've got, this is kind of an old model I made to kind of show a convergent skills of kind of literacy here, where we have all these things coming to play. I don't have in the early ones the social, emotional, and stuff that goes into making sure that the child's motivated, engaged, and wanting to be there to do this. But this is kind of a different kind of, it has that too. So, you can just look at a battery of tests. So this is a child who was tested here in Tennessee, in the state, not at the center. I went out into the field and was doing this as part of a research study. This was a struggling reader, was not getting tiered instruction. This was when RTI square was actually happening. So this is a third grader that was sitting in a Tennessee school, not receiving any tiered instruction. RTI square was being implemented in third grade. I've marked this with red being below average, yellow, which is not anywhere on that screen, being below average, and green being above the low average range and the average to above average. So you can see that we use the Gray oral reading test. We use the Woodcock reading mastery test. We also use the word identification and spelling test. We use the comprehensive test of phonological processing, and I use a Wechsler abbreviated intelligence scale to get measures of oral comprehension. I also use listening comprehension measures off the Woodcock measure to get the listening comp. So we can place this on the reading wall and we can see what's happening here. Reading comprehension is out. This child is not able to read because reading is comprehending. But what's causing that? Where would we want to put the instructional time, and how would we want to integrate and make sure that we covered our bases in all areas of literacy? Well, I want to make sure that they transfer, and any word level skills that I teach them is embedded in the sense of teaching them the skills, then also having them apply it to actually read and get meaning and take advantage of these strengths up here. This child has both listening comprehension in the average to above average range. This child also has expressive and receptive vocabulary in the average to above average range. This child is not an issue of being deprived of an oral language knowledge base. Reading fluency is out in this child. Word reading accuracy and efficiency, so timed and untimed, is out in this child. This child cannot decode words. This child does not know sound symbol correspondences at the very simple level. And this child does not have a well-structured phonological representation of the sounds within words and cannot hear those sounds within words. This child has a double deficit in the phonological processing that go kind of along with that, which is rapid automatized naming. So even though we might remediate the skills levels that support and will allow them to better use that knowledge to comprehend, I would be surprised if their reading fluency were to move very much because of the RAND underlying problem. But we can get that to move, and we should focus on that. But you would want to actually address what we need. Again, we'd want to teach them and get these skills and these knowledge components of language. You know, knowledge of the sound symbol correspondence is knowledge. The structure of our language is knowledge. Morphological structure of our language is knowledge. It actually directly impacts our ability to extract meaning from words. They're also skills, because when we apply that knowledge to actually attacking print, we apply that knowledge in a skills-based way. And obviously that's impeding their ability for when they don't hear the language and they have to read the language off of print. They can't apply the knowledge they have of vocabulary and their skills for comprehending and making inferences and driving mental models to represent the word structure when they hear it to actually do the same thing for reading. So in the old model, if we were to wait around and we waited for them to fail till 3rd grade, we wait for them to need because they're flopping on the ground. That's the tricky thing about dyslexia when we define it the way we do, which is based on its characteristics. It's very much like Parkinson's in this way only. You know how much of the brain is gone in the dopaminergic centers before you actually see the motion symptoms of Parkinson's? 90%. You see subtle cognitive deficits well before that, but we didn't know to look for those. We also don't know what causes it, so we don't know what's going wrong and causing those to go out. Think about it from a heart disease standpoint. I have to have a heart attack before you really know that my veins are clogged up and gonna cause a problem and give me a heart attack. So I have to see a child flopping on the floor, not able to read and spell. So preventing and finding kids earlier and being able to provide that support is very crucial. We won't be able to delineate without response to instruction if they're garden variety, if they're home environment, or they're neurobiological. And it doesn't really matter because good preventative work would look the same for all children if that was what their focus is on. The same thing. I've already mentioned there's neurobiological bases for oral language and receptive and expressive things. And if I see a child come in and they don't have that knowledge base for language, I want to remediate that. I want to help them with that. I want to enrich their environment so they can gain that. That child does not need that. But there will be reasons for that. And that could be home and cultural. That could be lack of good instruction in the classroom. It could be for lots of different reasons. RTI doesn't care what the cause or the reason is. It just needs to know what the problem is and you address the problem. The response will delineate and determine if my little kiddo probably has a neurobiological basis for this and will be a persistent resistor and need lots of instruction over time, or they're going to respond very quickly because it was their garden variety and there was something else happening that was more environmentally focused. What do characteristics look like in the classroom? And importantly, what I want us to focus in on is how do we know when a student is struggling? What information can be used to identify deficits? How can we look at student information? And how can we link student information back to instruction? A key component of what you're about to see is based on the idea of differentiating the core instruction, which is the hallmark of RTI and RTI squared. All children get differentiated instruction, which means that we need to be monitoring not through benchmark assessments, but also just response to the core instruction. It's part of what we do as educators in implementing RTI squared. So what you're going to see is me using ongoing probes being used in a school in Tennessee with a first grader. And how you can look at that information to inform and to determine if they're responding without having to wait for the end of the year to intervene and help, because we've passed the benchmark for the winter. So of course, when I'm making this decision, I need to pull in some information from my data team. Or as a teacher, I need to be thinking about what's going on and where I might be seeing stuff. So this is JW. He met all developmental milestones for motor, social, and oral language development. Now there is a family history of reading disorder, specifically in word reading accuracy in the family. So we have one risk factor for a problem with word accuracy reading. A pretty sizable risk factor in this case, because he's got it in his family. And it's a first link. It's one of his parents. JW's parents read to him nightly. Okay, that's good. Both parents work with him on homework nightly. Both parents actually go in and volunteer in JW's school in this classroom, working with the teacher. I know this because I'm working in this school. The center is working with this school. So they come in and they volunteer their time. Dad has a full-time job, mom has a part-time job. Sounds like a pretty awesome home to be growing up in, right? Both parents provide an enriched language environment. Both are college educated. Both have advanced degrees. JW is exposed to enrichment activities to support his development. He gets to go to summer camps. They're academically focused. He gets to do things elsewhere too. So he's got a good environment. I'm saying this because that's one of those risk factors too, and that's one of those things that we need to be worrying about. Is it a lack of good home environment? Of course, now we need to look at the other environmental factor. What happened with JW during kindergarten in this school? So let's look at what happened. Whole word instruction and sight words and high frequency words. Check. I'll show you in a second that that's a good thing. We need that. They use level readers, and he had level readers used in his classroom. That's fine. Want that connected text time? Applying that, doing that, that's fine. There was academic language instruction, so inferencing, cause and effect, building vocabulary. Check, that was there too. Memorized words for spelling test. No systematic direct way of teaching any spelling patterns linked to any kind of just direct word study. Just memorize a list of words, come in and read them or spell them in kindergarten. That's a red flag from an instructional standpoint. I would hope others would agree on that one. No direct phonics instruction in this classroom or in this school in kindergarten. That's a check mark, that's a red flag. It also goes against the reports that Candace McQueen, our commissioner, and her team have put out there saying that their survey data says that we do a good job in the state with that, not in this school. No direct systematic phonics instruction. No formal letter formation. The children in this school are not taught systematically how to print their letters. It's something they're supposed to come in knowing to do. I know, right? I'm with you too. All right, so there's a handout in here that we put together. I want to take a second to talk about actual foundational reading skills, K through 3, and what we know from evidence. First off, let's start with what we all need to be working on as well as everything else. Academic language skills, oral language development. There's a research base for this, and we should do it. Inferential language skills, narrative language skills, academic vocabulary. We should directly teach academic language skills and knowledge. That's what we use in the RTI, in the Read to Be Ready documentation here, and the commissioner's teams have put together for us to reference as educators in the state and public schools. We should model the application of these skills when reading connected text or listening to connected text. Support the acquisition of academic vocabulary during wide reading or wide listening. Directly teach academic vocabulary. What does that mean? Teach vocabulary when students listen to and read. Use targeted word vocabulary in other contexts to reinforce learning. That's that elevated classroom discussion that you guys as educators know that across our grades K through 12 we should be doing as educators. Directly teach grammatical structure. That might be later. This is K through 3 and then 12. And then inferential processing. Engage students in oral comprehension and reading comprehension activities that have them predict, problem solve, hypothesize, or contrast, have students link information to their background knowledge. All critical things that we should do for every child. And the bottom of that is just where you would pull your various sources of data so that we're your universal screener and your survey level assessment processes within your schools within RTI Square. Also reading fluency, not a big thing in kindergarten, so I'm going to pop through this pretty quickly. But you will notice that even in reading fluency, it's not all about just that text reading. You'll notice that we want just not all control text, we want wide reading. We also want comprehension monitoring going on and having comprehension questions going on. Children need to have modeled for them that we read text to get meaning out of it. That's well in alignment with the Read to Be Ready initiative within the state as well. Word reading, decoding, sight word reading, high frequency words, spelling. Directly teach skills that support word recognition and provide opportunities for students to read words in isolation, in phrases, and in sentences to support mastery. Again, I want to focus on in K through 3 here. I mean, we're not doing this in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade for all these kids. Unfortunately, we find kids who are back at this reading level in our schools, and they come to our center to be tested. So there's 2 reasons why I'm showing you this. One, I'm talking about a case study of a child in kindergarten who didn't get this. They were not directly taught phonological awareness. They were not directly taught the letter formations, which is part of this practice guide. Based on the research, this is supported by our Department of Education over the last 20 years. Directly teach sound symbol correspondence, wasn't taught that. Directly teach word parts and patterns, that would be a higher skill that would start coming on now. You could probably work on some of that, I guess, but directly teach high frequency words and irregular words, whole word instruction, that was being done. And it should be done. See, there's an evidence base to it. We need that. In our language in particular, we do. And the memorization of spelling is in contrast to the research basis of what we should be doing instructionally. So, I have concerns about what the instruction was actually. And that was in this entire school. The thing is that most of the kids in the school learn how to do a lot of this, but our struggling readers who don't have a good home environment, don't have mom and dad helping them, or have some other reason why this is happening, will fan out. Another thing that Candace McQueen and I agree on is that there would be a risk of dyslexia being over-identified if we said that every child who struggled to read was dyslexic, if we didn't look at response. So we agree on that one. Unfortunately, one of the first things that I did at the center was I've been publishing available data out of Arkansas and Texas. The Arkansas data are shaming. 45% of the schools in first grade in the state identify 0 dyslexics. 45% of the schools in second grade identify 0 dyslexics. Don't quote me exactly on those. I can give you the numbers if you want. Not finding any is an issue. There should be at least one. When we get into the secondary grades, by 9th grade, 95% of the schools in that state do not find a single dyslexic. They don't exist. They all go to Eureka Springs, they see the Christ of the Ozarks, they touch the feet, they're cured. Which you don't cure dyslexia. So it'll be interesting as we start sharing back from the Dyslexia Advisory Committee and my center gets that and we publish those data to see what our rates of identification are in Tennessee. If we're doing any better. All children are not dyslexic, but you should be able to at least find one of them. Otherwise we wouldn't have over 100 years worth of research in genetic and brain imaging that says that this is something different, but it's not a 20% identification rate. It just isn't. Yes, ma'am.
Board in a grade in the state.
Correct. So what I did was I looked at the district level, and then I looked at the grade level within the district. So 45% of the schools at the districts in Arkansas, I was at the school level, schools in Arkansas in first grade do not identify a single dyslexic. You could argue with that one. I'll give you that one in the sense of maybe it's not been long enough to identify them and they're being a little cautious. They're waiting for that response to instruction. But by third grade, we shouldn't find schools that identify 0. I threw out the magnet schools. I also threw out the charter schools. Those are just the public schools. I don't disagree that we could have an over-identification if we got really crazy with identifying, but at least in Arkansas, they have a gross under-identification problem. Yes, ma'am.
So identifying, were you looking at alternate names for, because like in the state of Tennessee, we don't have an educational disability category titled dyslexia. It would be language impairment, specific learning disability. So is that taken into consideration in these studies that we don't specifically?
Right. So, my study, yes, in Tennessee and Arkansas, the letter of the law and what they're supposed to be doing is identifying and reporting the number of dyslexics. In Tennessee this year, starting next year, due to the letter of the law, you guys will have to do that as well. It doesn't matter if you don't have a categorization for that. The law holds you accountable for reporting back. But in Arkansas and Tennessee, they have state level training and guidance on that, and they do it, and it's in the reporting system, and they're supposed to be reporting that back. In those states, just like Tennessee, dyslexia can fall under 504, general education within tier 2 or tier 3 if you find characteristics of dyslexia, or an IEP. And there's nothing to prevent somebody from, in the drop-down menu, saying the cause as being dyslexia. But in Tennessee, the state law requires the Dyslexia Advisory Board to actually report back to the stakeholders, me being one of them and a researcher who will use this data to do actual research with it and give a reporting back to the state on what we're finding. But you're right, you don't have a diagnosis category for dyslexia. But in Arkansas and Texas, they do, and they're supposed to be using the word. And many in here would say that in Tennessee we are as well, in the sense that you could call that. Nothing prevents you from saying that that's going on. I do have a slide that I do want to get to that kind of helps to clarify this, but this is a point, but it's a point of confusion in the state. There's nothing that prevents you from using the word dyslexia. But you don't, anyway, okay. But I took that into consideration in Arkansas and Texas. Whole word instruction and sight words and high frequency words is used with this child's phonics instruction, leveled readers, academic language instruction, no structured spelling instruction, no letter formation. So now we have a structured phonics program that's been going on for this school year in first grade. So this is what he sounds like reading a passage the second semester of first grade.
I'm a caterpillar, munch, crunch, I'm getting bigger. Munch, crunch, munch, crunch, munch, crunch, that's it. Now no more food. I'm done. It's time to hug for a stem. I went and when I shoved, I twisted, I spinning. My skin was my old skin fall away. I am softly inside. I am a pupa. I grow a shell to protect the pupa. I am now a pretty. I keep changing soon. I'll come out. What will I be? A butterfly. Push, crunch, whoa. I'm free. My wings are all wet. My wings dry off. They under flap, flap. I can fly. Tab, bab. I zip, flap. I visit flowers. I draw nectar. I drink nectar. Yum. My mother, is like my mouth. I sip, sip, sip. I have a mountain. We visit. My flowers were not away of birds. They now want.
There's the error analysis if you were to do a running record this way with this child. So that was his third time to read that passage, by the way, because this was the passage being used for repeated readings across the week. That was his third time. So why did he know pupa? Because that had been corrected earlier. So one of the things that we've created at the center since I've been here, and also as a handout as a Blackline Master, and we train in our trainings, this is very time intensive and laborious, and people who use the program in this school can actually use a weekly probe or bi-weekly probe to look at the phonics skills being trained or being taught to see if the kids are actually responding to this. But what I'd like to do is just take this sample, which most of you, if you're teaching at this level or if you're an administrator in a school, would have available to you, and look at it a little bit differently than we would. Typically what we would do is we come in here. So I have a passage from earlier of 1/2017. We have a rate pretty low on this child, 29 words per minute. Accuracy was 90%. On this passage, the third time through, his rate was 51 words per minute, and it was 82% accurate. It's at frustrational level for both passages. So we have it broken down to where you can actually put the errors to look at what the word structures are, which is helpful because these are the word structures that are being taught in the phonics program. And so you'll see that they cluster around the vowels, which are very variable in our language and are a real issue for our struggling readers. This is the actual item analysis where you put in what was supposed to be read versus what was read. Now, we link this back now, and we train teachers how they can link this back. Now, you ideally would be using your probe from your curriculum. If you're using a core reading curriculum that does have a phonics piece, you should have a probe that would allow you to be doing this on an ongoing basis so that you could differentiate your core instruction and catch this child before he got this far along. Because now what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you those errors placed on that core where instruction is being provided, and it's what should be being provided based on the research, but is it being provided at the intensity, which would be slowing the pacing down, extra time on that it would be needed. So you can see that they go through short A, short I, blend, beginning blends, short O, R blends. They have a writing week, short E, short U, ending blends. We got some consonant digraphs that pop up. We got some long A patterns coming up. We got a long A and open, long A and vowel consonant E patterns. We got some soft C coming up. We got soft G. We got the trigraph DGE popping up down in there. We got long O being taught, both open syllable type as well as the vowel consonant E pattern being taught in this core phonics instruction. We got a vowel digraph of OO being taught. We got some other patterns that pop up here. We got some diphthongs being taught over there. Here are the high frequency words that are taught as part of this program. So the things that come home and are being worked on. One being sent home every week and every night with the children in this school in first grade, and as well as being worked on in the classroom. So you see they're covering a lot of these irregular and high frequency words on an ongoing basis as part of this program. All right, so the passage was read during week 22 of first grade. So let's do an error analysis. First off, he didn't know A. That's a high frequency word. It's the fourth word on the Fry list. That's covered in every kindergarten class in the entire country. Right? That, ninth word on the Fry list, covered in every kindergarten class in every state in this nation. Didn't read that. Third time to try this passage. What? High frequency word, 33rd word on the Fry list. Did not read that. Taught in every single class in kindergarten in every state, every country, every state in this country. From, high frequency word, 25th word on the Fry list. Now I've highlighted that what was covered in week 1 of the first grade instruction, again, it was also covered in kindergarten. It's also from was covered in week 15, it was also covered in kindergarten. So this child's had multiple opportunities through multiple memorization practices to acquire these words. Differentiation of core instruction would be monitoring this progress on a regular basis linked with the instruction itself, not waiting for a benchmark, which wouldn't. Benchmarks are transfer measures, guys. They're not your curriculum-embedded, curriculum-linked measures, so they don't help you differentiate instruction at that level. They don't. They're not designed for that. The Dibbles and Ames Webb and the PATH and the PASS and whatever you're using are not designed for that. They're designed as screeners to find skills-based deficits or kids who can't comprehend. They're not designed to find out if actually they're learning what you're teaching them. They're learning if they're transferring what you're teaching them to other things. So now we can look at this. So we have a closed syllable A, first grade, first week. We have a closed syllable A, again, first grade, first week. We have two things here. The digraph SH was covered first grade, week 10. Closed syllable E, first grade, week 7. Vowel consonant E pattern, first grade, week 13. Open syllable I, week 14. Vowel digraph AI, week 19. Vowel digraph OW, not covered yet. That'll be covered in week 28. Hopefully he'll learn that. I don't know if he will. He's not learned a lot of other things. The diphthong OW is not taught in this curriculum in first grade. And then the vowel digraph AW, week 32. So of the errors he made, were these because he wasn't exposed to it from an instructional standpoint? No. He had lots of opportunities starting in kindergarten to read several of the words on that list. And if we like the look-say method, he had a lot of time to memorize those from the look-say method as well and didn't do it. I call the look-say method because that was what we've been calling it historically, but it's the whole word method. Both are needed. I've highlighted both. I've highlighted research for both. He's not picking it up from either of those. So, is the student responding to the core reading instruction? No. All right, so this is another thing that we've created since I've been at the center. It's kind of an evolution of what Diane Sawyer was doing when she was the chair. So what we've developed is a way of mapping data from various sources It's a front and back printout in your handouts there to help us identify kids who are showing characteristics, which is a word that we can use in Tennessee, of dyslexia. It's got a front and a back to it. I'm going to walk you through how you use it. So on the back side of it, you have a student literacy profile, parent-teacher observations. So this is based on the Colorado Learning Disabilities self-report screener. Parents, teachers can fill this out. It's the reading subcomponent of that. It was validated on roughly 10,000 students. It's a very good predictor of reading comprehension. So if we look at this, consistent school attendance in the case of this child, the teacher says yes. Appropriate core reading instruction, the teacher says, the first grade teacher says yes, I covered my bases. We can have a conversation about spelling some other day, but she says she's got it, and I'd say that what he can't do, she's been teaching. Hearing, visual acuity, motor function within normal limits, yes. Proficiency with the English language, yes. Oral and expressive language issues, not a concern for this teacher with this student. Has an intellectual disability been ruled out? Yes, she feels like he does just fine. As we'll look at some other testing, he's actually had an IQ test done. Just fine, average to above average. Has emotional disturbances been ruled out? Yep, he seems really good. His BMOD chart's always in the proper behavior. He's not an issue. He's never been disciplined once. All right. Sorry, that wasn't the Colorado. This is a little checklist that we did to look for your exclusionary criteria based on IDEA. I apologize, John. There's the Colorado Learning Difficulties questionnaire. So this one is a self-report that the parent and the teacher can do, and so the teacher filled this out. So, has difficulty with spelling, frequently quite a bit. Has had difficulty learning letter names, rarely a little. This was not really an issue for this child to occur. This is the first grade teacher listing this information. Child knew his letters. Not rating that as an issue. Has difficulty learning phonics, sounding out words. She rating him as sometimes. Reads slowly, always. Reads below grade level, frequently quite a bit. Requires extra help in school because of problems in reading and spelling, frequently quite a bit. His score on that is 22, based on the modeling that was done with trying to predict actual reading comprehension. That's a high significant risk factor for this child. So this is another way of screening. This is a behavioral screening that allows you to quickly get some information out to know if you've got some reason to maybe dig a little bit deeper. So we post this off of this. This was it's a research generated thing. I got this out of an actual peer-reviewed APA journal, pulled it out, put all this together. The International Dyslexia Association also has a document that does the same thing. We just did it here at the center so we would have it, put them on a little screen for you guys to have. So now the front side of this is where we collect different sources of information. We have student name, we've got the case name up there, grade, semester, I blanked out the date. Student attendance, good, rarely misses. Student behavior, always in positive range on the BMOD chart. Reading instruction, core program, level reader, no tier 2 or 3. The screener being used isn't catching this child. They're not using any weekly probes or biweekly probes to catch and differentiate the core instruction, which is what we're supposed to be doing for RTI square. So observational information, we just do it really simple when we're looking at this level, kind of teacher level, pluses and minuses. I'll show you norm reference scores here in a second. So vocabulary, non-reading measures, vocabulary kind of reading, listening comp. So when we think about it, parents and teachers say this is a strength or this is not a concern, the vocabulary of this child. Listening comprehension is a strength, it's not a concern for this child, one of those. So they just put little plus marks there. The standardized norm reference tests, again, an actual IQ test that was done, has confirmed this. He's average to above average in both of these areas. Phonological awareness, the teacher has a concern, the parents do not. The norm reference test that was done did not find an issue with phonological awareness. Because of the historic deficits in this family, this child got early preventative service from preschool in phonological awareness. Phonological memory, which is important because, as I said, you can remediate phonological awareness just peachy keno and still have brain differences that prevent you from responding to core instruction or instruction. That was just my research. phonological memory. Not a problem according to the parent, not a problem on the C-top. RAN, not a problem according to the parent, not a problem on the C-top. Reading fluency, both parent and teacher identify this as a problem. The CBM that was used, the DIBELS, came up with a rate that was fine. They also say that word reading accuracy is an issue, so the word accuracy score off the DIBELS was well below benchmark, wasn't where he was supposed to be. See that problem with the false negative potentially there if you use one source of data to try to come at this? Word reading accuracy is also found to be a problem on a standardized norm reference test for this child. Phonological decoding efficiency, both people have problems. Actually on the test of word reading efficiency, because he's memorized so many words and he goes so quickly and he reads through them, he was fine because he just had a really rapid shot and was able to get enough out. But when you look at a norm reference untimed measure of word reading, he is well below average. Phonological decoding efficiency, or phonological coding, we think that he has problems with both parent and teacher, and the norm reference test confirms that. Spelling, the parents think he might be a problem. The school doesn't really teach that, they're not really looking at that, but the norm reference test confirmed the spelling problem there. So you'll see with a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15, word reading accuracy, a score of 70, as well as a phonological decoding score of 70 is well below that range of 85. So we have a false negative happening in this school, and RTI square is not catching this, is not the safety net to check this child, but we don't have any issues or worrying about this child's knowledge of oral language skills and vocabulary and academic knowledge. How did we know this student was struggling? We just listened to him, right? It wasn't hard, guys. We're just being teachers. This child could not bloody read. I didn't have to wait around for the DIBELS or Ames Well or PATH or PASS to let me know that. What information did we use to identify that? Just what we were doing in the classroom. I just took what they were doing every week and ignoring and just looked at it. Here, use this information. It's right there in front of you. It didn't cost you anything. How did we look at the student's information? I linked it back to the student's core instruction. That's very important because I need to make sure the child had the opportunity to learn what he could not do. And did I document that for you guys? Did I document it very well? I did. He can't do what he's had since kindergarten to be able to do. Did not learn those high frequency words that get drilled and killed into kids' heads through all of these look and see methods. And are in every single leveled reader that he would have approached. Come on. The fourth word on the fry list is going to be in every book he's ever had shoved in his face. Every book that ever came home with him. Every book that his mom and dad ever read to him. He didn't read it. It's pretty obvious. How did we link the student's data and information back to instruction? Systematically. Again, I know that's cumbersome and that's a problem. These programs that you guys are using have these probes that you can use to better differentiate and capture these kids and pull people out for small group work to do that work that you can do. All right, this is a depressing set of slides and I've been told never to use them or we're running low on time. Where are we at? So I'm gonna, you guys don't want to know how bad the RTI data looks across the nation, do you? We're really dismal at implementing RTI, but we know that because we have lots of challenges. This is an important slide here. I think this is also important in the current context of Read to be Ready as well. There's a real reason to motivate the work that the commissioner is having us do across the state. The work of Hugh Katz, Don Compton, a previous Vanderbilt psych professor, they've been studying the late emerging poor readers who pop up fourth grade and after that we didn't see earlier. And this is the distribution of what they look like. You'll have kids who are going to pop up and just really struggle with reading comprehension, but they can read accurately and fluently and efficiently. You know, those name callers. Notice that there's a big portion that pops up here after fourth grade. They were under the radar for first, second, and third grade and they pop. But I also want to call your attention to there was also 30% of these kids who when they get to really hard multisyllabic word structure, they bottom out, but we're not looking for them anymore. We also have a blended garden variety mix up there that pops up after 4th grade as well. So what we learned from that research and the ongoing research that's being done by several people still is some students struggle with word reading issues, will not struggle with reading until after 3rd grade. We already knew this and we still know this. There's multiple types of poor readers. That doesn't take a neuroscientist to tell you guys that. Not all poor readers have word reading deficits. And word reading deficits can surface late. 48% of late emerging poor readers had word reading deficits. So, there was a question earlier that I want to come back to, which is, when it comes to dyslexia assessment in Tennessee, the different stakeholders do? We got started on time, but if you give me just 3 minutes, I want to walk you through these, because we find at the center, we go across the state, that there's lots of confusion, and I've promised people at the state level and in the stakeholder groups that we would be a point of clarity on this and not confusion. So in school-based settings, what's the purpose of the evaluation that you guys are doing? It's to screen for characteristics, determine instructional needs, and determine eligibility for special education services. You're supposed to be differentiating the core instruction. I showed you some ways to do that. You're supposed to be slating those kids who, when you do that, they're not responding, and get them into tier 2 and tier 3. And that those persistent poor responders, you need to be finding and identifying if they need to be going to SPED. That's what you guys do. When a parent pays $1,200 to go outside of the school to go and get a private assessment done, what's the purpose of that? It's for diagnostic, and then sometimes you'll get instructional recommendations off of that. So when they go to somebody with an MD or PhD after their name and some licensure letters after that, that's what they're doing. And determine patterns. So what do we do at the center for our limited testing that we do in support of our research and the mission of our center? We determine patterns of strengths and weaknesses with literacy skills, determine instructional needs, and recommend appropriate instruction. That's what we do. Criteria is important. What guides what you guys are doing in the school? You know this, and we're just going to cover the other two. You guys know that you're beholden to the Department of Education here at the state level, and the eligibility standards and guided, which is what was being referenced earlier. And you're also guided by IDEA, as well as the RTI square process. You heard me reference both Read to Be Ready, give you text and verse, as well as the RTI square manual, which we've read and synthesized and actually written a book that we can get you if you want it on dyslexia with an RTI square that takes on no procedures, and we have a whole chapter on progress monitoring. We have a whole section that has all the CBMs and some examples of those, as well as developmental skill progression that we can provide you guys. What is that person that gets paid $800, $1,200, actually $1,200 if you actually go to an MD? They're going to use probably the DSM-5, the Diagnostic System Management Criterion Established Definition of Dyslexia, and the Established Definition of Dyslexia. What do we use at the center? Evidence of word level reading deficits following the IDA, which is the state's definition of dyslexia. That's what we follow. If I find a kid who can comprehend on a reading comprehension test, but they are dismal at accuracy and efficiency, I'm going to say they have characteristics of dyslexia, guys. Because the oldest thing that we've documented since Dr. Orton was doing his clinical work in Iowa, and then we've continued to publish data on in the 80s, 90s, and today's, I sound like the hit radio station is that we can have kids who can pass a reading comprehension test but can't read every third word on that test. That child has characteristics of dyslexia. When they come to the center, we'll say that. And that's how we determine characteristics of dyslexia. And it would seem that that's in compliance to say that that child should be getting some services if you identified those in probably tier 2 or tier 3. Now, they wouldn't qualify if they're meeting your achievement standards, likely for IDEA and eligibility for special education. Who does the testing? In school-based settings, you're going to have school psychologists and school student support teams. In private settings, you're going to have, again, that PhD level, that MD level person, or somebody working under that supervision of that person. So a clinical psychologist with licensure and the credit and the actual endorsements needed, a developmental pediatrician would be doing that work. An SLP would also be doing that work. Who's at the center? Most of us have doctor in front of our name. We have 2 PhDs. We have an educational doctorate. We also have an educational specialist who is a national certified school psychologist. I happen to be currently an certified academic language practitioner. All three of the other assistant directors will soon be CALTS, certified academic language therapists. Terms used, which is really important. This is exactly what we're talking about earlier. In the school-based setting, what is typically used is specific learning disability and basic reading, specific learning disability, reading fluency, characteristics of dyslexia. Those are the school terms that are used. We've worked with several districts, talked through several different programs, as well as in the new state guidelines on dyslexia that's been published. There's nothing that prevents you guys from using characteristics of dyslexia in any of that process. Here in the private setting, when they come back with that, they're going to have specific learning disability, specific learning disorder, because under IDEA it's a disability, under DSM-5 it's a disorder, with impairment in reading, and they could choose to use the word dyslexia. I am not clinically trained in a psychologist. It's funny, I actually did have an appointment in clinical psychology at a med school for several years. But my PhD is in research. I'm a developmentalist. That's what I do. So we don't have a PhD or medical level person to supervise what we're doing, so we cannot do formal diagnoses out of the center, no matter what anybody wants us to do. Can't do that. We're not staffed or appropriately trained for it. But what we can say is that we can say that a child has characteristics or a profile of dyslexia, which means that we can pretty much do the exact same thing that you guys can do back at the school. Again, I'm not an MD. I'm not a clinical psychologist PhD. My school psychologist is not in the school setting, so her licensure would be in jeopardy if she ever made a diagnosis, and she will not, because I don't want her to lose her license. So I can't do that. I can make the same call that you guys do back there. So that's kind of the setting. So then the benefits of these different things. So in the school setting, there's great benefit. Assessment teams are very familiar with the student and the history of the reading progress. In fact, the transient's a real issue, guys, and we know that, right? Because of that. When we have these high-risk populations that are moving around, we don't have that valuable information about the history that's been following them, and that's a problem for us in schools. Response to instructional needs, you guys know what they're getting instructionally. You're able to track that in progress monitoring and have all that wealth of data right there in your fingertips. And then you can also recommend school services and accommodations. These other two sources, we can make recommendations, but they don't have to be implemented. The ultimate decision about any of that resides in the school and the team back there. Private and clinical setting, I guess you can get a formal diagnostic statement. And that is very helpful because that's what you need for SAT and ACT accommodations currently. So parents will often contact the center thinking that we can do a diagnosis, which we don't. If we did, then they could actually take that letter and get accommodations for SAT and ACT. We're never staffed that way. Never. Never. In all 25 plus years. There's never been an MD or a clinical psychologist sitting on staff at our center. We are not the center's testing center for dyslexia to make diagnoses because we've never been staffed to be ever to do that. So then what can also, accommodations for university, they can do that too. So clarify observations made by the teachers. We can help to confirm or disconfirm what you guys are seeing, maybe find some false positives, confirm. And we can also help to provide some instructional strategies and show you that case and weaknesses. There's some real challenges here too. So I appreciate you guys staying a little bit later. We need to shut down so Mitch can get ready and the next group can come in. Thank you so much. I'll be available for questions if you have any. Thank you for your patience.